Welcome everybody to this session. We will have three speakers, one in presence and two online. We begin with our first presentation, which will be addressed by Dr. Phani Krishna and Anaga Paniker, entitled Policy, Polity and Identity of Language Diversity in India. So I would like also to thank our audience online who are with us online, and of course they will have the floor if they have any questions or in our presentations. So we begin with our first presentation. Thank you.
Hello and greetings from University. Firstly, I would like to congratulate FEL 2023 on the successful conduction of this conference. Today our topic is Policy, Polity and the Identity of Language Diversity in India, and this is a collaborative presentation between myself, Anana, and Dr. Phani Krishna. So, the national education policy are these policies that are proposed to reform the educational system in India. And here in this work, we have tried to critically examine the strategies of the national education policies and its impact on the linguistic diversity in India. So, it also attempts to shed light on the issues relating to language in education policy and the intention of the national education policy with special reference to the NEP. The study analyzes and compares the education and language policies in India and evaluates any potential modifications or estimating their effects on the endangered languages. Educational policy is a linchpin in the nation's education system, and these policies they aim to develop cognitive abilities like literacy, numeracy, critical thinking, problem solving, and these cognitive abilities they need to be promoted within an integrated learning environment. The education policies should also aim to promote ideals like social justice, equality, and tolerance. The national education policies have attempted to promote linguistic diversity and linguistic variety by focusing on multilingualism and the idea of mother tongue education. But there have been some gaps in the implementation processes, which are really from a result from a lack of innovative ideas, and we should discuss about these gaps of implementation further in the presentation. So coming to the background of the study, language in education or language in school planning is very frequently overlooked, and it is an essential part of language policy. So Nancy Hornberger has provided an integrated language policy framework that she proposed in 1994, and it constitutes a very coherent language planning framework. And there are many dimensions to language planning, and some of the key elements of the framework include status planning, corpus planning, and acquisition planning. So status planning, it looks at the issues regarding the formal or informal status of a language. So it deals with power dynamics or prestige, language prestige, and social acceptance of a language. Corpus planning, it basically looks at language structure and standardization, and on how a grammar or vocabulary or script of a language can be developed. The acquisition planning, it focuses on the actual learning of the language, and there are creating language learning resources and methods. Now coming to the methodology that we have used in this paper, so a comparative analysis of the education and language policies that have been proposed has been conducted, and by incorporating Hornberger's integrated framework model, we have attempted to evaluate these policies, that is the national education policies that were proposed in 1968, 1986 and 2020. Coming to these national education policies, the first national education policy, which was called the National Policy for Education when it was formulated in 1968, and it aimed at the reformation of the education system, and the main ideals that it focused on were national integration and learning of regional languages. It was in this education policy that the three-language policy was proposed, but the implementation process of the three-language policy had a lot of hurdles because of the opposition from the non-Hindi speaking states, who then later just continued to use the two-language policy. So in the three-language policy that was proposed in 1968, it aimed at having three languages that need to be studied from school, and for the non-Hindi speaking states, Hindi was the third language, whereas for the Hindi speaking states, it was proposed that a southern Indian language would be taught to the students. The NEP 1986, that was the second NEP that was implemented in India. It reiterated most of the aspects that are there in the National Education Policy of 1968. It promoted the idea of the use of modern Indian languages as the medium of instruction, but it extended this idea into not just for medium of instruction for school students, but also in the universities as well. So that is what the National Education Policy 1986 talks about. The National Education Policy of 2020 that was implemented in the year 2020, it reintroduced this three-language policy and has also given a lot of emphasis on mother tongue education. So the NEP 2020, like I mentioned before, it just reintroduced the three-language policy of 1968, and though it has been opposed before by the non-Hindi-speaking states, despite that, has been reintroduced in 2020. So the question really is that why did they have to revive this three-language policy when it was being opposed by so many of the states, especially the state of Tamil Nadu? And also the question arises, how will this policy be implemented without actually imposing language upon the students of certain states? The second issue that we see in the national education policies, especially 2020, but also the previous education policies, is that there exists a gap between the policy framework and the implementation strategies. So for the implementation, for example, for mother tongue education that is emphasized in NEP 2020, a lot of the curricula needs to be revamped, and also a lot of reading materials, resource materials and study materials needs to be published in order to effectively implement mother tongue education. Also, a lot of resource materials and study materials needs to be translated into the local or the regional Indian languages in order to effectively implement mother tongue education, and also to use, if we need to use these regional languages as a medium of instruction. So, as the NEP 2020, it promotes bilingualism and concept of multilingualism, which can really be effectively brought about in school situations when there is a bilingual school setup, bilingual classroom setup. And so for this, there is a need for teachers to be trained, and also proper recruitments of such trained teachers to take place. So teacher training programs need to be set up. The third issue is the gap in addressing the concerns of the preservation of endangered languages. There are many endangered languages in India, and there is a growing concern for linguists to be able to preserve these languages, and not just preserve them, but actually have primers and written materials for the speakers of those languages so that they can revitalize, they can use these resources to revitalize their language. And so the national education policy has not really mentioned, there's a lack of steps that are to incorporate them into the education system. If the national education policy is emphasizing on terms like mother tongue education, then even the languages that are not spoken by a large group of people, the non-dominant languages of the region, must be addressed as well.
Thank you, Anurag, for giving an elaborated discussion on the work. To give a brief idea, as most of you are aware, the diversity that exists in India, there are multiple languages and there are some tribal languages which are still not documented. Various branches of language. In Indian language policy and this education policy, as you're aware, they both go in some sort of hand in hand. And it has played a very crucial role in managing this linguistic as well as the cultural diversity that inherits in this country. Now, India is, like I said, incredibly diverse, and managing this linguistic diversity actually poses challenges and opportunities. Now, how well a policy is made becomes a question, at least to one of the people in this country, because they might be speaking another language. Now, policy has evolved over a time to address many complexities, like in a historical context, especially in the case of India. For almost 200, 300 years of colonization, the colonization legacy, the historical influence that the British had on India, it played a very significant role. That's why we had Macmillan model of education until recent times. And English has gained the idea of prestige and power during this colonial period. And it continued even the post-independence after 1947 in India. Now, this language movement came into light somewhere around 1960s. That's where our first policy comes to emergence somewhere around 1968. So this language movement, now post-independence, there were languages-related movement. Now anti-Indian position movement was happening, and there is another movement parallel to it, like let's have Hindi as a lingua franca rather than English, because it is a language of British, or because anyway we colonized a long time. Now reflections of these they were in a great need of balancing. Linguistic diversity, you call it, or avoiding favoritism was one of favoritism to a single language was happening in family. Now, in this whole discussion, this national education policy came out somewhere around 19, like Anna spoke just now with regard to 1968. Now, this 1968 policy came in this framework of three language formula, emphasizing that study of, let's say, regional languages alongside teaching Hindi uniformly across the country. Now, Sanskrit also came in light. Now, Sanskrit has also been given that encouraging spirit in this time frame. But then, two and a half decades later, we had 1986 policy. Now, national education policy in 1986, it also aimed to the next step. When she was talking about the Burke's model, which talks about the education should be more inclusive, the curriculum should be more inclusive. They will have to look upon not just about what is just not just about education or how student is learning, but outcome. What is the outcome or how inclusive it is? So, based on few of these ideas, somewhere we came up with reducing the social disparities. As you know, India had barriers with regard to caste, and there were particular castes which were not, taking minimum basic education. And this policy has this introduction, or call it introduced measures such as scholarships. Like let's say somebody from a community where they have never been to school or they were never education. Those first generation students were getting scholarship. Adult education was also taken a proper shape. Now hiring of teachers from other marginalized community also came into light. And after 1986, so for a long period of time, these ideas were going in parallel. But after the emergence of the technology, called it computers, India came, during Rajiv Gandhi's time, somewhere around 80s or somewhere near to early 90s, computers came to India. So the whole system started changing. Now, this policy, the present policy, the 2020 policy, it has its own lapses yet. I think 2020 policy is this amalgamation of many things that took from 68's policy and 86 policy to make it much stronger and make it India-centric sort of education. Now, national education policy reflected on these contemporary concerns that India should have. Let's say, as you're aware, countries like Germany or China or these are examples that I immediately think of, where producing their research work or theses in their mother tongue or writing in their own script. But in India, it's only in English. Now, 90% of the research. So, this mother tongue based education was a strong idea behind this policy, and encouraging multilingualism on contemporary, not just mother tongue education, but yes, you have multilingual policy in there. And there's an idea called inclusive curriculum, and it emphasizes use of more technology and community involvement and so on. Now, these policies, especially policies in recent, that is this NEP 2020, encourages the importance of early education, like I said, mother tongue education, development of cognitive abilities, or in terms of inclusiveness, they are also talking about how specially impaired population should have their teaching. There are few challenges and concerns because after the independence, most of it was English dominance that in academia, the Indian academia took that English dominance in higher education, especially in the urban areas. Now, English has remained the dominant medium of instruction all over the country. Now, this creates a sort of clear disparity for a reason that there are tribal languages, there are widely spoken languages which are not really given regional language medium education. So all these things are also in a sort of debate. So it actually becomes, the preservation of these endangered languages becomes one of the key features, at least in the Indian context. And over a period of time, let's say if these languages are lost, then the socio-cultural context is also lost. The diversity of these socio-cultural practices, community involvement, this is lost. And even it is a threat to the idea of globalization also. Globalization and technology developments have added complexity to languages and language policies. English proficiency is often seen as a key factor, but to save a particular language or to understand the socio-cultural point of view, I think language is the key element. Now, language encodes all this data, but in the NEP 2020, this idea has been strongly reflected. Now, that is to say, holistic and flexible education. That is like MEP 2020 actually advocates the flexibility in the education system. Breaking down the barriers between this arts and science, and it has this new era's requirement, that is interdisciplinary studies or multidisciplinary studies. While they aim to have the 1968 policy or 1986 policy, they were aimed to be more flexible, but maybe because of the resources during the time, or call it due to non-technology integration, maybe it had some clear lapses in understanding. But the problem lies here is that, irrespective of this technology integration, also this language barriers or understanding language barriers, I think, like what I was talking about with regard to creating primers. How do we create that? So this is a long-term process. It's a futuristic vision that this MEP 2020 has, but there are immediate things that are quite necessary. Let's say we're talking about inclusive curriculum design. So in this inclusive curriculum designing, what is that idea that MEP 2020 would reflect? While these has some very clear implications that with regard to MEP 20, the point that I would like to make is that inclusion of this Sanskrit or classical language. Now, MEP 2020 highlights the interaction or call it presenting Sanskrit and its rich literature and also the other classical languages like Pali and Tamil. Tamil is one of the oldest languages which clearly recorded. Now, while the other policies during 68 and 86, they were more of a regional language spoken in Hindi, and they were not really clear on what happens to Sanskrit, Pali, or in the case of any tribal languages or those lesser known or less spoken languages. Now, community involvement becomes a key factor, and this I think NEP 2020 emphasizes with regard to lifelong learning also. Now, emphasizing community involvement in education aims to provide a clear life learning opportunities to all the citizens, as well as these initiatives were there. The social economic development initiatives were also existing during this 86 and 68 policies. But the difference is that in terms of flexibility or in terms of inclusiveness, I think the present policy acts pretty well. But there lies a huge issue in terms of implementation in this diverse country. Now, it's one of the great things about act versus policy. See, in policy you can still make some actions, and you have opinions to give on. And I think this is the best time. Maybe this particular policy still have to evolve in terms of providing how we can implement this in mother tongue based education, or call it how do we implement it in such a big nation with great diversity. I think this can be answered only after maybe a decade or so. Like I said, probably the aim of the present policy is not immediate, but maybe down the line after a decade or two, the fruits of it will be seen. But the core attitude that has to be developed among the researchers of this country who are working on education, language, linguistics, and so on, is creating that literature or helping the government to make primers will also become a very crucial thing. Because see, it is not about just policy or implementing for social political needs, but any policy should be beneficial to the citizens of the country. Disparities they exist, and some tasks might seem impossible, but the time can actually provide better answers. Now, to give some brief conclusion, I would say that there are some concrete steps that have to be taken, and this has to be surrounded majorly on the lesser known languages or languages that we call it as minority languages and so on. Now, this debate can only give fruits if these people, like linguists, like people from education, sociology, history, they come together to give a better framework. Now, the need for critically evaluating the policy framework, rights of minority language communities and so on have to be, like I said, taken into consideration. So I think this policy will have a clear implication on. It is good to see that there are some languages that are already taking a shape of implementation by going through basic education, like in class 1, 2, 3. These primers are released in some of the tribal languages, but not in many. So it is a long-term plan to see some great work in the future by the policymakers and academicians. So this is a brief idea that we gave. Thank you so much. Once again, we thank the FEL for organizing this wonderful conference. Thank you so much. And these are some references of, there are some future recommendations also we made. Because of this decade of indigenous languages, I think there should be more concentration on these languages and so on. You can see that. And these are a few works that we refer to. Thank you all. If there is anything, you can kindly mail it to us. Any question or any collaboration also, we will be very happy to work on. Thank you everyone. Have a nice day.